Now, we're going to talk about propaganda. It's been around for mostly all of human history. Some primitive examples go back as far as the 500th century BC. Likewise, fake news and terrorism are not exclusively 20th and 21st century phenomena. But what can historical efforts to tackle misinformation and political violence teach us now, here, in 2024. Well, joining me now is James Crossland, Professor of International History at Liverpool, John Moores University, whose book, The Rise of Devils, Fear and the Origins of Modern Terrorism, is out now on paperback. James, welcome. Good to see you. Thanks for coming into the studio.
Thanks for having me.
It is very true, that, isn't it, that the rise of sort of fake news that we've had, particularly, since, I would say, 2016 onwards, it's sort of become a big catchphrase. Fake news is nothing new, is it?
Nothing new at all. Nothing new at all. You can find fake news carved into stone in Egypt 5,000 years ago. You can find fake news. But in the modern form that we're talking about, and I don't mean to throw the people in this building under the bus, but it is the modern mass media that really starts to develop in the 1850s. That's where fake news starts to explode in the way that we recognize it today.
And I should imagine that the advent of social media and the internet has sort of turbocharged that even more.
It accelerates the process that had already been established, whereby you can throw something out there, even if you know that it's nonsense, even if you know it's deliberately misleading. It can be picked up. It can influence people. That process started with newspapers and periodicals 170 odd years ago. Today, the process is accelerated because of how fast everything moves online.
So, James, tell me about the book, The Rise of Devils, Fear and the Origins of Modern Terrorism. It's out on paperback now. Tell us about the book.
What I wanted to do was to basically figure out where terrorism started. And terrorism, as we understand it, is a non-state actor trying to use violence to further a political end. I traced that back first to the 1890s when anarchists started blowing up cities across Europe, took it back further to the 1850s, and that was my start point. And a big part of the reason for the start point, as I say, is because that's when mass media really starts, and that's a key part of it because it facilitated the process of radicalization.
And in your book, you look at how we've tried to tackle misinformation, political violence, terrorism, as you were just describing it there. Can we take lessons from how it's been tackled before and apply them to today's politics, to today's conversation?
We certainly can. I mean, if you... Back in the era that I'm looking at in Rise of Devils, there were no media controls. People complain about partisan reportage today. Try looking 170 years ago. People could put anything out there. Now, that sort of environment exists online today, and that is part of the problem, is that because anyone can put anything out there, you get the spiraling effect. It's incumbent upon media organizations that do have regulations to follow them and to ease back on the sensationalism, particularly around acts of political violence, which was something that was not done 170 years ago. If anything, there was a lot of hyperbole, a lot of fake news, and that just increased the fear level. So when you're reporting, you've got to be responsible. You've got to temper down the fear. You've got to be Spartan with details. Don't let people know precisely what's happened to an extent. You've got to try to tone down the rage, if you like.
Mm. And do you think that perhaps in today's age of trying to be first, trying to get that story out as soon as possible, do you think that that's a major factor in the mistakes that are made? Because some misinformation does come from genuine mistakes.
Yes, certainly. And I would say that's part of it. Definitely is that in the rush to be first on the story, you're going to put something out there. I honestly think that thinking back, because my starting point for this book was thinking about 9/11 and the immediate aftermath of that. If you look at how reportage of terrorism was in the first 5 or so years of the war on terror as compared to how it is now, we've come a long way in terms of responsibility, in terms of tempering things. There's moments where misinformation does slip out, but by and large, I think there's been some lessons learned in the last 20 years.
What would you, having done this work and having written this book, what would you like to see more of, particularly as we are, a big election in the UK, one would argue an even bigger election in the US and the run-up to November 5th between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. What are your fears? in this election period, and what would you like to see happen?
My fears are the fears that I think most people have, is that both sides are going to escalate rhetoric, which might then lead to violence. As to how that process can perhaps be halted or at least eased, I think it's down to making sure that reportage is fair and even-handed. Stepping back from sensationalistic terms to describe people who are trying to foment political violence
Do
or
you think we're
agitation.
past that, though, James? Do you think that I see it all around like you do? You know, channels, whether they are media channels, whether they're social media channels, feed off conflict. The idea that you're going to put out a piece of news with just the bare facts out there has now become almost sort of old-fashioned. People want the commentary. People want to see the conflict, the difference of opinion. Do you think we've sort of passed that point where we can go back to, actually, there is going to be no commentary, there's just going to be a reporting of just facts?
I think there's always going to be a place for that. Whether or not that garners a massive audience is another question.
Right.
But as regards to playing the game, as it were, of giving people what they want, I think there's a way to do that where you can take both sides and kind of call it for what it is. You know, don't
Maybe one is classed as commentary and the other one's classed as news.
Well, that would be helpful. The line, as you know, between those is very, very blurred.
Yeah.
And that distinction, I think, is often not appreciated by the people reading one or either. They kind of go for both in that respect and see them as equal. Reinforcing that distinction would be helpful, but I think just being able to be very clear about what it is that is being presented by both sides on either argument, however extreme it is, and putting that out there and not taking one side over the other, not favoring one over the other, that's as clear as you can get to being unbiased, which is obviously very difficult.
Well, James, thank you for coming in. It's good to see you. Thank you for telling us about the book. It's out on paperback now. It's called The Rise of Devils, Fear and the Origins of Modern Terrorism. It's a fascinating book. It's out on paperback. James Crossland, Professor of International History at Liverpool John Moores University. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
Thank you very much, Alexis.
It's half